In the next few hours, a man who's barely managed to keep his life together will find himself standing at the gates of Buckingham Palace, about to commit an act so audacious that it will shake the British monarchy to its core. No one could have predicted what was about to happen. Michael Fagan's story, a tale of chance, rebellion, and absurdity, was just beginning.
Please, if you can, take a moment to subscribe to my dad's channel. It would mean the world to him. May God bless you and fill your day with joy and peace.
Before we dive into this moving story, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from today. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will stay with you long after they're told. It's a chilly evening in Kilburn, London, a neighborhood steeped in history and colored by the whispers of Irish immigrants who had made it their home. The streets are wet, soaked by the steady downpour of rain, reflecting the dull glow of streetlights. Michael Fagan is walking through them, hands buried deep in the pockets of his worn-out coat, shoulders hunched against the wind. He's in his early 30s, a man whose face tells the story of dissatisfaction. His eyes tired, as if they've witnessed too much, his lips set in a permanent grimace. He isn't a criminal, not yet. But life, in all its monotony, has worn him down. At his flat in the heart of Kilburn, life is a constant blur of small struggles. There's no luxury, no promise of a better future. It's just the same gray routine, day after day. He drags himself through the motions of work, a dead-end job at a construction site. When the day ends, he returns to his flat, a small, dingy place with peeling wallpaper and the smell of dampness clinging to the walls. It's not much, but it's his. And it feels like it's the only thing he has left. Inside, the hum of the television fills the silence. Michael is sitting on a tattered armchair, staring at the screen but not really watching. He's used to this, the sound of the TV blending into the buzz of his thoughts. He's been living like this for a while, too long maybe. His mind is a jumble of half-formed dreams and frustrations. He used to be someone who believed he could make something of himself. Now, it seems he's just surviving. There's a knock at the door. It's Carmen O'Reilly, his close friend. She's been trying to get him out of the flat for weeks. Carmen, unlike Michael, has a steady job at a local cafe, a place she loves. She's the type of person who believes in second chances, in getting back up no matter how many times you fall. Michael used to admire that about her, but now, he just feels empty. Carmen steps inside, her eyes scanning the cluttered room. She knows Michael is spiraling. "Michael," she says softly, "you're not still stuck in here, are you?" Her voice is firm, yet caring. "It's been weeks. You can't just sit here moping around. You have to do something." Michael looks up from the TV, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I don't know, Carmen. Nothing's changing, is it? I've tried. I really have." She pulls up a chair and sits down across from him, watching him with the patience of someone who's seen this before. "Life's tough, sure, but you've got to fight back, Mike. You can't just let it swallow you whole." But Michael doesn't want to hear it. He's been hearing it all his life. The advice, the pep talks, the clichés. What good has it ever done him? So he brushes her off with a half-hearted wave, then stands up abruptly. "I'm going out. I need a drink." Later that evening, Michael stumbles into McGowan's, the local Irish pub where most of the regulars have been drinking since the afternoon. The place smells like stale beer and wood, with laughter echoing off the walls. Michael slides onto a stool at the bar, ordering a pint of Guinness. He needs the familiar comfort of alcohol, the buzz that numbs the edges of his life. As he sits there, the TV mounted above the bar flickers to life, showing an announcement: Queen Elizabeth II is in London, staying at Buckingham Palace for the weekend. Michael doesn't even blink. The Queen, a figurehead, a symbol of something so distant and untouchable. It's like a fairy tale, something out of a history book. He's never thought much about the monarchy, but tonight, as he sips his drink, something about the announcement sticks with him. He listens as a group of friends at a nearby table begins to chatter about the Queen's visit. Seamus Gallagher, a regular at the pub, leans back in his chair, throwing his arms in the air as he talks. "Can you imagine, lads? Buckingham Palace, big old gates, security everywhere, guards posted at every turn." "A bloody fortress," Seamus says with a grin, gesturing wildly. "No one's getting in there. Not unless you've got the bloody royal seal on you." The other men laugh, but there's something in Michael's gaze that shifts. A thought, an idea slowly forms in his mind. A thought that will change everything. The quiet hum of the pub fades into the background, replaced by the racing beat of his own pulse. What if he could? What if he, just some guy from Kilburn, could break into Buckingham Palace? The mere thought is absurd, a drunken whim. But that's what he likes about it. It's impossible. It's impossible. No one, especially not him, would ever get past the gates, through the security, and into the inner sanctum of the palace. But as the alcohol begins to take hold, he becomes more vocal, more reckless. "I could do it," Michael says, his voice a little louder than he intended, causing a few heads to turn. Seamus eyes him, raising an eyebrow. "What?" Seamus asks, leaning forward, his grin widening. You could break into Buckingham Palace?" Michael leans back, the challenge sparking something in him. His hand tightens around his pint glass. "I bet I could get into the Queen's bedroom tonight, right into her bloody bed." The group falls silent for a moment. Then the laughter starts. Seamus slaps the table, roaring with laughter. "You get into the Queen's bedroom?" Seamus scoffs. "You'll be caught within minutes, mate. It's impossible." But Michael's words hang in the air, bold and defiant. "I'll bet you all £5 I can." One by one the men at the table laugh and begin to pull out crumpled fivers. They each hand Michael £5, laughing at the absurdity of it all. But Michael doesn't laugh. He's dead serious. "The bet is on." "All right, mate," Seamus says, still chuckling. "We'll see if you're in the papers tomorrow, getting carted out of the palace in cuffs." Michael grins, a mischievous glint in his eye. He stands up, the world swaying slightly beneath him, his mind already racing with possibilities. "I'll be back with proof," he says, more to himself than anyone else. "Just watch." Michael Fagan's hands trembled slightly as he stepped out of McGowan's pub, the echoes of laughter still ringing in his ears. He had just made a bet that, in hindsight, seemed ridiculous, but the alcohol coursing through his veins made the impossible seem just another challenge. With £5 in his pocket and an idea in his head, he made his way to the nearby taxi rank. The streetlights flickered above him, casting pale yellow streaks on the rain-soaked pavement. Michael's boots slapped the wet ground as he hurried to the first available cab, a beat-up vehicle with fogged windows and a driver who looked like he'd had his fair share of late-night fares. The taxi smelled faintly of cigarettes and wet wool. Michael slid into the back seat, his excitement palpable. His mind was racing. What had he just agreed to? What was he thinking? But it didn't matter. He had already committed. "Buckingham Palace, mate," Michael slurred, his voice thick with drink. He could almost hear his own heartbeat pulsing in his ears. "Straight there. I've got something to do." The driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, glanced over his shoulder, raising an eyebrow. "Buckingham Palace, huh? You off to see the Queen, are ya?" Michael leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Not exactly," he said with a grin that could have been either confidence or insanity. "I'm going to break into her bedroom." The driver burst out laughing, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Break in? Into Buckingham Palace? You're having a laugh, mate." Michael shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of his own words now. But he couldn't back out. Not now. "I'm serious. I've made a bet. £5 says I can get into the Queen's bedroom tonight. It's gonna happen." The driver chuckled, shaking his head. Right. Well, you'll have to let me know how that turns out, won't you?" He muttered something under his breath about mad bastards as he turned onto the main road, heading towards the palace. As the taxi sped through the rain-soaked streets, Michael's thoughts wandered. What had started as a drunken dare was now a real plan. His head was clouded by alcohol, but there was something else too. A stirring, a desire for something to break the monotony of his life. Something that would make him feel alive. Maybe this was it. Maybe this would be the story he'd tell for the rest of his life. But as the taxi neared Buckingham Palace, Michael's heart began to race. The dark, looming walls of the palace came into view, and for the first time, he felt a sharp pang of fear. The taxi driver turned his head slightly, glancing at Michael with a bemused smile. "You sure about this, mate?" Michael swallowed hard, suddenly unsure of himself. He looked out the window at the towering walls, the high gates, the ornate ironwork that seemed to mock him. This wasn't just a building, it was a symbol, a fortress, the heart of the British monarchy. But then the thought struck him. What was the worst that could happen? He was drunk. He was out of his mind, and for once he wasn't going to let doubt stop him. "Yeah," Michael said, his voice more sure now. "I'm sure." The taxi slowed as it approached the gates. The palace was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt almost unnatural. The driver pulled up to the curb and glanced back at Michael. "You're on your own now, mate. Good luck with that," the driver said with a chuckle, clearly convinced that nothing was going to come of this. He waved Michael off as if to dismiss him, a final laugh escaping his lips. Michael stepped out of the taxi, adjusting his jacket, his heart pounding in his chest. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, but the night air was cold and sharp. Buckingham Palace loomed ahead, an imposing structure that seemed to dwarf everything around it. Michael looked up at the walls. They were tall, too tall, and there were cameras everywhere. This was madness, but the challenge was already in his blood. He couldn't turn back now. The first step Michael took towards the palace gates felt like crossing an invisible line. As he walked up to the edge of the palace grounds, he instinctively lowered his voice, as though the walls themselves might be listening. The quiet hum of the city faded away, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the soft patter of rain on the cobblestones. The imposing structure of the palace was before him now, its walls tall and smooth, standing like a barrier between him and the absurdity of what he had planned. His eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of security. The guards, with their rigid postures and stoic faces, were nowhere in sight. Michael's pulse quickened. How could this be so easy? The palace, the fortress of Britain's royal family, was shockingly, almost tragically vulnerable. He approached the wall, scanning for a way up. There were no obvious footholds, no ladders, but there was a drain pipe that ran up the side of the wall, partially hidden in the shadow of the palace's massive stone structure. Without hesitation, Michael grabbed hold of it, his hands slippery with rain. He was intoxicated, certainly, but there was a certain clarity in his decision now. The climb was slow, awkward, his boots slipping on the smooth stone, his heart racing with each step. Sweat trickled down his forehead, mixing with the rain as his fingers gripped the cold metal of the drain pipe. But somehow, against all logic, he made it. He reached the top. His body, trembling with exertion, hung precariously over the edge. His legs kicked for purchase, his eyes scanning the grounds below, where guards were supposed to be, but there was nothing, no movement, no signs of life. It was eerily quiet, like the palace had been waiting for him to arrive. From that height, he could see everything: the gardens, the gates, the distant silhouettes of the guards pacing in the distance, unaware. He could feel the weight of the palace pressing down on him, and for the first time, he wasn't just a working-class man from Kilburn. For the first time, he felt like he was someone who mattered. Michael pulled himself over the edge and onto the balcony with a grunt. His legs shook beneath him. The adrenaline was starting to course through his veins. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. He was in. Once inside the palace walls, Michael found himself in the heart of history. A space so rich in power, so dense with the presence of the monarchy, it felt surreal. The sheer absurdity of it hit him. How could this be happening? How had he, an ordinary man, made it this far? The balcony he landed on was bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. For a moment he simply stood there, taking it all in. The silence of the palace was almost oppressive, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was trespassing in a place where no one had dared to go in centuries. But time was of the essence. The idea that he might be caught, that the guards might suddenly appear, made his legs tremble with urgency. He had to move. The palace was huge, a maze of corridors and rooms, but somehow, Michael found himself walking in the right direction. There was a sense of inevitability to it, as if he were being guided. It was like he had been here before, even though he hadn't. And then, there it was. The door. The Queen's bedroom. Michael stood in front of it, breathing heavily. It was just a door after all. But to him, it was so much more. It was the final piece of his insane challenge, the culmination of the bet. the proof of his madness. He opened it without hesitation. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the four-poster bed at the center of the space, surrounded by elegant furniture and priceless artifacts, and there, lying in the bed, was Queen Elizabeth II, asleep, unaware of the intruder standing just a few feet away. Michael's heart skipped a beat. The room was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as if the very walls of Buckingham Palace were holding their breath. The air was thick, hanging heavy with the weight of 1,000 years of history. The dim light from the street lamp outside barely filtered through the thick velvet curtains, casting faint shadows across the room. The four-poster bed, a symbol of royal luxury, looked untouched, serene, and entirely oblivious to the madness unfolding just feet away. Michael Fagan, swaying on his feet, stood at the foot of the bed, staring at the woman who lay there. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times in the blurry haze of his drunken stupor. But now, with reality pressing in on him, he didn't know what to do next. His chest was tight, his thoughts scattered. There she was, the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, sleeping soundly, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding just outside her door. The surrealism of it hit him all at once. This was it. This was what he'd come here for. He was in the Queen's bedroom, a place where only a select few ever dared to enter. But what now? He was drunk, uncertain, unsure of the next step. Michael stumbled forward, his footsteps barely making a sound on the plush carpet. He caught himself on the edge of a chair, steadying himself as he tried to process the absurdity of the situation. Then, without warning, the Queen stirred. A soft rustling noise broke the silence. She shifted in the bed, her movements slow and deliberate, like someone waking from a deep, undisturbed sleep. Her eyes fluttered open, confused at first, blinking in the dim light, and then, just as Michael took another step toward her, she spoke. "Is that you, Philip?" Her voice was soft, laced with sleep, but there was an unmistakable trace of confusion in it. Her eyes, heavy with slumber, settling on Michael, as if she were still caught between dreams and reality. Michael froze. The words didn't land right. He hadn't anticipated this moment when the Queen, still half asleep, mistook him for her husband, Prince Philip. But there was something about the way she said it, the calmness in her voice, the smoothness of her words, the composure of someone who had seen far more bizarre things in her life than the presence of an intruder. Michael blinked, unsure of what to do, his head swimming from the alcohol. He cleared his throat. "No," he said, trying to steady himself. His voice was an awkward imitation of a posh accent, as though he had rehearsed it 100 times before in his head. "It's me, Michael." The Queen's brow furrowed. She stared at him, confused for a moment longer. Her eyes, pale and sharp even in her drowsy state, studied him, assessing the situation with surprising calmness. Her hands, delicate and poised, were resting on the blankets, and her breathing was slow, even. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice less firm now, but still holding that regal dignity. Michael laughed nervously, his words slurring slightly as he tried to make sense of the surreal situation. Michael Fagan," he repeated, almost as if the name might make the moment less strange. I've come to talk." There was a slight quiver in the Queen's lips now, but she remained composed. The calmness in her voice, despite the bizarre circumstances, was unnerving. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her tone not rising to panic, but carrying an unmistakable authority. Her eyes didn't leave him, as if she were sizing him up, considering how best to handle this intruder in her private space. Michael's hands twitched. He had no idea what to do. He had no plan. This was madness. But he couldn't stop himself now. It wasn't just the alcohol or the surreal nature of the moment. It was something deeper, some twisted urge to see this absurdity through to its bitter end. He didn't know why he had done this. He didn't know what would happen next. But there he was, sitting on the edge of a royal bed, with the Queen of England looking at him with mild confusion. "Don't worry," Michael mumbled, trying to sound reassuring. "I won't be long. Just wanted to ask for something." The Queen's eyes narrowed slightly, a flash of wariness crossing her face. It wasn't fear yet, but it was close. She straightened, pulling the blankets a little closer around her, as if creating a barrier between herself and the intruder in her room. "Ask for something," she repeated, her voice still composed but now carrying an edge. Her gaze was steady, never wavering. "What is it you want, Mr. Fagan?" Michael swallowed hard. He had been here for a reason, hadn't he? He was drunk and his thoughts were muddled, but there was one thing that had kept him going, one thought that had kept him determined to get this far. A kiss. The absurdity of it hit him again. The request was ridiculous, childish, something out of a fever dream, but it was the only thing he could think of. "A kiss," he said, his voice slurring, trying to make light of it. "Just a kiss, Your Majesty." There was a long pause. The Queen's expression didn't change. Her eyes flicked to the door as if considering her options, weighing how best to deal with this unexpected intrusion. But she didn't scream. She didn't shout. She remained composed, in control. In a situation that would send most people into panic, the Queen simply looked at Michael, and in that moment, he realized something. This wasn't just about him, it was about her too. It was about the power of silence, the strength of composure in the face of madness. The Queen wasn't panicking. She wasn't begging him to leave. Instead, she remained stoic. "No," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension, "I will not." The simplicity of her refusal, so calm, so absolute, struck Michael harder than anything else in that room. It was like a slap in the face. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't even angry. She just didn't care about his demands. She wasn't going to give him what he wanted. She wasn't going to dignify his madness with any more response than necessary. Michael's breath caught in his chest. The silence stretched between them. Her refusal hung in the air, thick with the weight of everything this encounter had become. The absurdity of the moment was clear now. The Queen, her dignity intact, her composure unbroken, had turned his demand for a kiss into a silent, sharp rebuke. He stared at her, unsure of what to do next. For a moment, the room was frozen, a snapshot of insanity in a place where none should ever occur. Michael blinked, trying to find words to fill the silence. The room was too quiet, too heavy with the strange weight of what was happening. He was drunk, disoriented, and now, in the face of the Queen's composed refusal, he felt more foolish than ever. "Please," he mumbled, slurring the words. "Just one kiss. Just for the laugh, eh?" The Queen shook her head slowly, her lips pressed tightly together. "No," she said again, the word of finality that Michael could feel in his bones. "I won't entertain such nonsense." Michael sat there, stunned for a moment, the tension hanging thick. He had expected many things, shock, panic, maybe even a scream, but this quiet, unyielding dignity, it was more than he could process. Michael started, but his words trailed off. He didn't know what to say anymore. The ridiculousness of his request seemed to be catching up to him. For the first time, he wasn't sure why he was even there. The Queen looked at him with a steady gaze, her eyes calm, her face unreadable. There was no anger, no fear, just an unspoken understanding. "You should leave," she said softly, but the firmness in her voice left no room for negotiation. "Now." The stillness that followed Michael's bizarre encounter with the Queen felt like an eternity. After she had calmly dismissed him, her voice a soft command, the room seemed to freeze, as if Buckingham Palace itself had paused in disbelief at the absurdity of the intrusion. The Queen, unwavering in her poise, hadn't screamed. She hadn't panicked. She hadn't even risen from the bed. But her next move was decisive. She calmly picked up the telephone by her bedside. She didn't need to say much. There was no need for elaborate explanations. Her words were simple, but they carried weight that no one could ignore. "Get someone here immediately," she said, her voice low but firm, her British reserve unbroken. "There's been an intruder." The line was brief. The call was made. No alarms blared, no sirens echoed in the halls. But within minutes, the guards, alerted by the Queen's call, stormed into the room. Their boots clicked sharply on the marble floors, the sound of their arrival a far cry from the soft shuffle of Michael's drunken footfalls. Michael, still dazed, stood frozen at the foot of the Queen's bed, his drunken stupor starting to wear off, replaced by the harsh clarity of his situation. His heart pounded in his chest, His breathing quickened, and his hands started to tremble. He hadn't planned for this. He had never thought it would go this far, never imagined the moment would end with him face to face with the Queen, surrounded by armed royal guards. The guards entered swiftly, almost awkwardly. They didn't look particularly well prepared for this. Their uniforms, crisp and immaculate just moments before, seemed almost out of place in the midst of such a bizarre breach. They looked at Michael, their expressions a mix of confusion, embarrassment, and disbelief. None of them knew how to handle it. A guard stepped forward, his voice gruff but shaken. "You'll have to come with us, sir," he said, his words clipped, the formality of his speech betraying the awkwardness of the moment. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. This wasn't just any intruder. This was Michael Fagan, the man who had somehow found his way into the Queen's bedroom, disrupting the sanctity of one of the most protected places in the world. As they moved to restrain him, Michael's mind began to race. This wasn't how he'd imagined it. His drunken bravado had faded, leaving behind a man confused, uncertain, and overwhelmed by the absurdity of his own actions. He didn't fight back. There was no point. He was going to be arrested, and the consequences would soon be far more real than any of his fantasies. The guards in their haste fumbled with their commands. One guard grabbed Michael by the arm, pulling him toward the door, while another adjusted his grip awkwardly, clearly unsure of how to handle someone who had just breached the palace with the absurdity of a drunken prank. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around Michael's wrists, the sound of it more real, more severe than anything he'd experienced in his entire life. As they escorted him out of the Queen's chambers and down the hallway, the sheer ridiculousness of the situation dawned on Michael. His drunken escapade, his reckless defiance, had led him to this moment. And the guards? They seemed almost embarrassed to be involved in such a farcical event. Outside Buckingham Palace, the night air was crisp, and the commotion that followed inside echoed down the stone corridors. The flashing of cameras outside the palace gates was the only sign of the unfolding spectacle. As the guards bundled Michael into a police car, the realization hit him hard. The entire world was about to know what he had done. The arrest of Michael Fagan, an unknown man from Kilburn, became the story of the year. The absurdity of the situation immediately captivated the public, and the media pounced on it. Newsrooms around the world scrambled to cover every detail. A man had breached the Queen's bedroom. He had wandered into Buckingham Palace unnoticed and sat on the Queen's bed. The sheer spectacle of the event became a media-feeding frenzy, and Michael's face soon appeared on every screen, every newspaper, every tabloid. Television anchors leaned into their microphones, narrating the outlandish details. How could this happen, they asked. The public, hungry for the bizarre, demanded answers. Across the world, social media exploded. Memes began circulating, photoshopping Fagan into royal portraits, turning him into an unlikely celebrity. The headlines blared with absurdity: "Man breaks into the Queen's bedroom, the most audacious crime in history," and "From Kilburn to the Queen's bed, the intruder who shocked Britain." News outlets couldn't get enough of it. The absurdity of the act, the sight of a drunken man stumbling through the halls of one of the most secure palaces in the world, was too much to resist. But as much as the media relished the outlandish nature of the crime, there was something else unfolding. A strange public sentiment began to build in Michael's favor. The more people read about him, the more they started to sympathize with him. Was he just a fool, or was he a man driven by frustration, by the crushing weight of his life, who had acted out of a desire to be seen? The public's perception was divided, but the story continued to captivate. The news reports began to speculate on Michael's motivations, delving into his background and his mental state. Some saw him as a figure of rebellious defiance, an embodiment of the frustrations of ordinary men who felt powerless in the face of a system they could never touch. Others saw him as a joke, a man who had wasted a lifetime on the fringes, only to make a fool of himself on the world stage. Still, there were many who couldn't shake the feeling that Michael was in some twisted way a hero, a man who had done the unthinkable, broken through the boundaries of a world that had always seemed untouchable. The more the media examined him, the more questions arose. Had he truly intended to harm the Queen, or was he just a drunk man looking for attention, lost in a haze of fantasy? His motivations became the subject of public debate, and for days Michael Fagan's name was on everyone's lips. The very absurdity of what he had done made it impossible to look away. The headlines, the speculation, and the questions filled the public consciousness, and Michael, for the first time in his life, had the world's attention. In the weeks that followed the arrest, the public's fascination with Michael only grew, but the court was far less sympathetic. On the surface, the case was simple: a bribery breach, a rejection of the order's legal stature, copyright infringement and fugitive claims for business assessment, a security breach, an audacious act that had threatened the very sanctity of the monarchy. But the legal proceedings quickly became more complex as the world watched. Michael Fagan was charged with trespassing and breach of security. He had entered Buckingham Palace, wandered through the royal corridors, and most controversially, entered the Queen's bedroom. He had violated one of the most sacred spaces in Britain, and the consequences were severe. The trial was swift. The defense didn't argue the facts. There was no need. Michael had done what he was accused of. The only question was what the punishment should be. Was he a criminal, or was he simply a man who had let his frustrations get the better of him? The prosecution painted Michael as a threat to national security, a man who had disregarded the sanctity of the monarchy. The defense, however, argued that Michael was a product of his circumstances, a man pushed to the edge, driven by frustration and the feeling of being invisible in a world that didn't care. In the end, the court handed down its sentence: 2 years in prison for Michael Fagan. It was a severe punishment for what had, in essence, been a drunken prank. But the case had become about more than just the act itself. It had become a reflection of a society that had allowed its citizens to fall through the cracks, a reflection of a world where the powerless sometimes acted out in ways that shocked the system. The first few weeks after Michael Fagan's arrest were a whirlwind. The world, consumed by the bizarre spectacle of his intrusion into Buckingham Palace, had formed 2 camps. One side saw him as a reckless fool, a drunken man who had dared to breach one of the most secure buildings in the world. To many he was nothing more than a joke, an absurd figure of chaos in a place that symbolized control, power, and order. But there was another side. The other camp saw something different in Michael, something more complex. They saw a man who had shaken the foundations of the monarchy, a man who had dared to defy the system and make a mockery of the very institution that for centuries had seemed untouchable. In their eyes, he wasn't just a fool, he was an underdog. He had done what no one had dared to do, and in the process, had forced the world to see the monarchy in a new light. Michael's fame grew, not because of his actions in the palace, but because of how the public interpreted them. His name was on the lips of every media outlet, every bar, every living room across Britain. He was now a symbol, but of what? The public perception was fluid, shifting with the tides of conversation. Some saw him as a hero who had poked fun at the powerful, a man who had exposed the monarchy's vulnerability. Others saw him as a fool, a man who had squandered his one moment of fame on a reckless stunt that could have ended in disaster. The media loved the story. The tabloids ran headlines that simultaneously mocked and elevated Michael. They called him the man who sat on the Queen's bed, and in the same breath they called him the King of Kilburn. It was absurd, but it worked. People began to rally behind him, not just because of his defiance, but because in some way, he represented a kind of rebellious freedom that many felt they lacked in their own lives. As the weeks turned to months, the story of Michael Fagan didn't fade. His name, his face, his actions were still present in the media, still dominating the headlines. But the story of the Queen, the woman who had been the victim of this absurd intrusion, was less talked about. It was easy to forget that, while the world laughed and speculated about Michael's motives, the Queen had, in her own way, been deeply affected by the events of that night. In her quiet, measured way, the Queen had spent hours thinking about the intrusion, contemplating its significance. Buckingham Palace had always been a symbol of security and power, but that night it had been breached. It wasn't just Michael Fagan who had entered that space, it was the world, with all its unpredictability and chaos. For the first time in years, the Queen had felt the sharp sting of vulnerability. But the Queen was not one to show her emotions openly. She was composed, as always, but in the solitude of her private chambers, she thought deeply about the events of that night. She knew the public's fascination with Michael Fagan would soon die down. The media would move on, as it always did. But she couldn't forget the shock of that intrusion. It wasn't just about the security lapse, it was about something more. In the weeks following the incident, a quiet, surprising gesture emerged from the royal household. The Queen sent a series of letters to Michael Fagan while he was in prison. It was rare for the royal family to engage with the public in such a personal way, but the Queen's letters were thoughtful and dignified, expressing concern for his well-being while subtly reminding him of the consequences of his actions. "I hope this letter finds you well," one of the letters read. "The events of that night were unsettling, but I trust you will find a way to move forward. The monarchy is a symbol of our nation's continuity, but it is also a symbol of our shared humanity. I trust you will take this time to reflect on what it means to be a part of this world." It was an extraordinary gesture, one that spoke volumes about the Queen's character. She didn't act out of anger, she didn't seek revenge. Instead, she extended a quiet, personal acknowledgement of Michael's actions, not as a criminal, but as a man who had made an inexplicable choice. It was a gesture of compassion, but also one that conveyed the weight of the monarchy's history. In the end, the night of 1982 changed everything. For Michael Fagan, it was the kiss of infamy, a reckless act that would forever follow him. He would always be remembered as the man who entered the Queen's bedroom, the man who defied the monarchy and poked at the facade of royal invincibility. His story became a legend, a strange chapter in the long, storied history of the British monarchy. But for Buckingham Palace, it was something else. It was a wake-up call, one that would forever alter its sense of invincibility. Michael Fagan had, in his own strange way, exposed the vulnerability of a system that for so long had been untouchable. And in doing so he became a symbol, a man of frustration, defiance, and, perhaps, a twisted kind of triumph. His legacy would forever be tied to the night that shook the monarchy to its core, a night that no one would ever forget.